Why every fallen civilization used the same power strategy and why America and Russia still do. Here's what nobody tells you about the Cold War. Both superpowers were terrified of the exact same thing, and I'm not talking about nuclear weapons or ideological conquest. I'm talking about something far more basic. Something that appears in the fall of Rome, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, and the dissolution of the Soviet Union itself. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll see why the strategy that seemed to guarantee victory to both sides contained the seeds of their own defeat, and why understanding this matters more than ever today. If you've lived through any part of the Cold War, you remember the certainty. American power seemed inevitable. Soviet strength looked unshakable. Both sides believed they'd found the formula. But here's where most people miss the actual story. Subscribe right now if you want to follow the full timeline of how these two systems built their empires. And if you've ever wondered which moments you lived through were actually the turning points, leave a comment below. Tell me which decade of the Cold War shaped your own understanding of the world. I read those comments. Wait, this is the important part. The strategy I'm about to explain appears not just in America and Russia, but in every major civilization that fell. And understanding it changes everything about why the Cold War ended the way it did. If you want the complete, documented breakdown of the power patterns that drove every major Cold War crisis, every proxy war, every arms race decision, the mechanisms and the historical signals that predicted what came next, that's all laid out in the comprehensive guide available in the description and pinned to the top of the comments. It's the deeper dive behind everything I'm covering here, and frankly, it's where the real clarity happens. The strategy is called overextension through simultaneous frontiers. And it's not a failure of intelligence or planning, it's almost the opposite. It's what happens when a power becomes so confident in its own system that it tries to manage everything at once. Rome did this. By the 3rd century, the empire was fighting on the Rhine, the Danube, the Euphrates, and North Africa simultaneously. Each frontier demanded troops, supplies, and administrative attention. Rome had the resources, for a while, but maintaining military presence across that many borders meant Rome couldn't concentrate overwhelming force anywhere. If an enemy pushed hard in one direction, Rome had to pull resources from another, creating a vacuum. The empire didn't fall because it was weak, it fell because it couldn't prioritize. The Soviet Union did the same thing, starting around 1962. Khrushchev decided the Soviets needed to compete with America everywhere, in Cuba, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in Afghanistan. In Eastern Europe, of course, and simultaneously, they were trying to maintain a nuclear arsenal equal to America's, develop space capabilities that matched or exceeded the Americans, and keep an internal security apparatus that could watch 30 million people across multiple time zones. The resources existed initially. The Soviet system could mobilize production in ways the American system couldn't. But mobilization isn't the same as sustainability. There's a crucial difference. America faced a different version of the same problem. After winning in Korea, or, more accurately, after fighting to a stalemate, the American system committed to what strategists called containment. Contain Soviet influence everywhere it appeared. Military bases in Europe, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and soon Vietnam. Intelligence operations across the globe. Economic aid to any nation on the border of communist influence. Space race spending that competed with the entire Apollo program budget. The American economy could handle this longer than the Soviet economy could. That matters. But the real pressure wasn't economic. It was psychological. Both systems developed what I'll call the doctrine of perpetual vigilance. The belief that if you stopped watching one frontier, if you reduced commitment even slightly, the entire system would unravel. It's almost rational. In a bipolar world, any gain for your opponent looks like a loss for you. Any retreat looks like the beginning of collapse. So neither side could afford to actually retreat. Not really. Not believably. Both became locked into defending positions they'd never intended to hold permanently. Both became trapped by their own success. This is where the fallen civilizations come in. Rome, the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, all fell not because of a single enemy, but because they ran out of the capacity to manage their own size. They overextended not out of greed, but out of necessity. Once you've taken territory, you have to defend it. Once you've committed troops to a region, You can't simply abandon it without losing credibility. Once you've made a promise to an ally, you have to keep it, or every other ally starts to wonder if you'll keep theirs. Both the Soviet Union and the United States understood this intellectually, but understanding a trap and avoiding it are different things. Neither side could step back without appearing to surrender. The trap had teeth. In 1960, the United States had roughly 900 military installations outside its borders. The Soviet Union, though catching up, had far fewer, but was expanding rapidly in Eastern Europe, Cuba, and parts of Asia. Neither power could claim it was merely defending itself. Both were managing empires. The difference was that America had the resources to sustain theirs, at least for a while, whereas the Soviet system was built on ideology and coercion, not on wealth. Vietnam became the proving ground for a theory both superpowers had inherited from their predecessors, that presence equals power. If you withdrew, you lost face. If you lost face, allies doubted you. If allies doubted you, they made deals with your enemy. The logic was airtight. It was also catastrophic. By 1965, when Operation Rolling Thunder began, the sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam, America had already committed 23,000 military advisors to the region. President Johnson expanded that to 184.00.00.00.00.00.00.00.00. The numbers kept climbing. By 1969, over 540,000 American soldiers were deployed across Vietnam. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, was trapped by a different equation. They couldn't let the Americans win in Vietnam without appearing weak to their allies in the developing world. They couldn't pull out. They couldn't escalate directly without risking nuclear confrontation. So they sent military advisors, weapons, and supplies to North Vietnam. Not enough to guarantee victory. Just enough to guarantee that America couldn't win cleanly either. This is where the parallel becomes obvious. Rome didn't lose its legions in a single season. The Ottoman Empire didn't collapse in a day. Both empires bled resources into peripheral conflicts, wars that seemed vital at the time, wars where retreating would mean dishonor, wars that consumed money and manpower that were needed elsewhere. By the time either empire recognized the pattern, the hemorrhaging had become structural. Withdrawal was no longer an option because the military-industrial apparatus that sustained the war had become economically essential. America in the 1960s faced an analogous problem. The defense industry was booming. Tens of thousands of jobs depended on military contracts. Entire congressional districts had economies built on weapons manufacturing. Eisenhower had warned about this in his farewell address in 1961, the military-industrial complex. But warning and resisting are different things. Hold on. Before we continue further, I want you to hold this observation close for a moment. The power dynamics at work here, the way military commitment generates economic dependency, which then generates political pressure to continue the military commitment. This is the foundational mechanism that every declining empire faced. And understanding it requires more than a timeline. It requires seeing the pattern across multiple civilizations, multiple centuries. That's exactly why our complete guide on civilizational collapse and strategic overextension is so valuable. It walks you through the signals, the economic indicators, and the decision points that separated empires that could adapt from empires that couldn't. You'll find that guide in the description and in the pinned comment. It's a resource built specifically for people who want to understand the deep architecture of power, not just its surface events. Back to the mechanism itself. Every escalation in Vietnam required justification. Every justification required optimism about eventual victory. Every prediction of victory had to be defended, because admitting you were wrong meant admitting you'd sent young men to die for a miscalculation. General William Westmoreland, commander of American forces in Vietnam, issued regular reports to Washington, claiming progress, a light at the end of the tunnel, he said in 1967. The Tet Offensive of January 1968 shattered that narrative. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched coordinated attacks across South Vietnam, over 100 locations simultaneously. Militarily, it was a defeat for the North. They lost far more soldiers than the Americans did. But politically, it was catastrophic for American credibility. The American public saw the images of fighting in the streets of Saigon, the capital. If the light was at the end of the tunnel, why was the tunnel still so dark? Support for the war, which had been declining anyway, collapsed entirely among younger Americans. Walter Cronkite, the most trusted news anchor in America, returned from Vietnam and declared the war unwinnable. When President Johnson heard that, he reportedly said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." 3 weeks later, he announced he would not seek re-election. The war continued for 4 more years after that. American troops didn't leave Vietnam until 1973. The North took the South in 1975. From the perspective of fallen empires, it was the familiar endgame. Enormous resources spent, enormous suffering inflicted, enormous credibility invested, and in the end, the outcome that most people inside the government knew was inevitable in 1965. What made Vietnam unique wasn't the defeat itself. Empires lose wars. Rome lost in Parthia. The Ottomans lost to Russia. Spain lost to Britain on the seas. The pattern repeats because military power, no matter how enormous, cannot sustain a conflict when the population controlling it decides the cost exceeds the benefit. Vietnam exposed something different. It exposed the mechanism. The American government knew, in classified assessments written as early as 1965, that the North Vietnamese would not surrender, that South Vietnamese forces were unreliable, and that the war could not be won in any meaningful sense. McNamara himself documented this. Yet the war continued for another 8 years, not because anyone believed it could be won, but because stopping it meant admitting it could not be won. This is the pattern every fallen civilization repeated, not the initial miscalculation, that is human and universal. The pattern is what happens after the miscalculation becomes obvious. Do leaders change course, accept the loss, and preserve some credibility for the next conflict? Or do they double down, pour resources into a failing endeavor, and exhaust the system trying to deny reality? America chose to double down. In 1968, after the Tet Offensive made it clear the war was stalemated, the military asked for another 206,000 troops. President Johnson approved sending 13.50. The rationale was always the same. One more push, one more year, one more sacrifice would tip the balance. That rationale lasted until 1973, when American forces finally withdrew, leaving behind 58,000 American dead and roughly 2 million Vietnamese casualties. The cost to American credibility was less obvious at the time, but more corrosive in the long term. The United States had presented itself as a superpower capable of projecting its will anywhere on Earth. Vietnam proved that wasn't true. A rural, agrarian nation with a fraction of America's industrial capacity had simply endured longer than Americans were willing to fight. That gap between rhetoric and reality created a wound in American self-perception that took decades to heal. Internationally, it was worse. Allies in Europe watched America exhaust itself in a peripheral conflict while Soviet power remained steady. Japan, West Germany, and Britain, critical partners in the Cold War structure, began to wonder whether American security guarantees were reliable. If America couldn't win against North Vietnam, what would happen if the Soviets moved on Berlin or the Middle East? The Soviet Union, meanwhile, had learned its own lessons from its war in Afghanistan, which began in 1979, but that story belongs to the next chapter. What mattered in the moment, though, was what happened inside America itself. The war had fractured the country in a way that previous foreign conflicts had not. World War II was supported across generations and regions. Korea had been unpopular but brief and accepted as necessary containment. Vietnam split the nation vertically, young against old, urban against rural, college-educated against working class. Those splits didn't heal when the war ended. They metastasized. By 1973, when American troops left, American society had already begun to ask a fundamental question. What exactly had the Cold War been for? Hold on. I need you to focus for a moment on this particular pattern, because it's essential to understanding what happened next in American strategy. Everything I've described so far, the miscalculation, the doubling down, the erosion of credibility, the fracturing at home, these are not unique to Vietnam. They're the signature of civilizations in decline. And crucially, how a power responds to that signature determines whether it actually falls or whether it adapts and survives. If you want to understand the full architecture of how empires use power, how they calculate risk, how they know when to fight and when to consolidate, the signals that were flashing in Washington in 1973, that's precisely what the complete guide in the description and the pinned comment covers in detail. It walks through the decision points, the classified assessments, the moment-by-moment reasoning that led both superpowers to keep pushing when the cost had become unsustainable. It's dense material, but it's the skeleton key to understanding everything that follows. For America, the question became urgent. Could the United States still compete with the Soviet Union if it couldn't sustain a war like Vietnam? Or had the system itself become too costly, too fragile, too dependent on a public consent that no longer existed? The answer came not from military strategy. It came from economics. By 1975, American defense spending had peaked during Vietnam and was contracting. The Soviet Union, by contrast, was spending roughly 12 to 15% of its GDP on military production, a figure Western analysts would later realize was catastrophically unsustainable. But in the moment, it looked like Moscow was outpacing Washington. The arithmetic was simple and terrifying. If the Soviets could spend at that rate indefinitely, while America's political will was collapsing, the balance of power would shift. Richard Nixon's administration had already begun something called détente, a deliberate effort to negotiate directly with Moscow rather than compete endlessly. The idea was sound. You cannot sustain great power rivalry forever on military spending alone. Both sides needed to reduce the temperature. But détente became a word that confused the American public. Did it mean peace? Did it mean surrender? The word itself became toxic. The Helsinki Accords of 1975 represented the high point of détente. Leaders from 35 nations, including the United States and the Soviet Union, committed to respecting borders, promoting human rights, and cooperating on technology and trade. On paper, it was the closest thing to genuine peaceful coexistence the world had achieved since 1945. Gerald Ford, who had become president after Nixon's resignation, signed it. Leonid Brezhnev signed it. Everyone agreed. Hold on, I need to stop here for a moment. There's a critical mechanism at work that most people overlook when they discuss the 1970s, and if you want to truly understand how the Cold War ended, you have to grasp this piece. The complete strategic guide available in the description, and I've pinned a special note at the top of the comments. It breaks down exactly what happened inside the Soviet system during this period, how the leadership saw détente, what their calculations actually were beneath the public statements. That foundation matters because what happened next wasn't random. The Soviet Union signed the Helsinki Accords knowing full well that Clause 10 committed all signatories to respect human rights. And then Moscow went home and ignored that clause entirely. Dissident groups began citing Helsinki language in their appeals for freedom. The regime suppressed them harder. Sakharov, the nuclear physicist and dissident, was systematically persecuted. Other Eastern Bloc nations followed suit. Poland saw the rise of Solidarity, a worker movement that would become the first crack in the Soviet bloc itself, but that fracture was years away. In America, détente looked different. It looked like weakness. Conservatives, particularly in the Republican Party, argued that Nixon and Ford were negotiating from a position of defeat, that they were surrendering American superiority in exchange for Soviet promises that Moscow would never keep. The argument had weight. Subsequent declassified documents showed that the Soviet Union used détente as cover to accelerate weapons development and expand its influence in Africa, the Middle East, and Central America. They signed agreements with one hand and broke them with the other. James Schlesinger, Secretary of Defense under both Nixon and Ford, grew increasingly alarmed. He began publicly warning that American military readiness was eroding. The draft had ended in 1973, replaced by an all-volunteer force that was smaller and, he argued, less prepared. Weapons systems were aging. The Soviet arsenal was modernizing. By 1976, the question wasn't whether the Soviets could catch up. The question was whether they already had. The 1976 presidential election became a referendum on détente and American strength. Gerald Ford, running for election after inheriting the presidency, faced a primary challenge from Ronald Reagan, a former governor of California and a vocal anti-communist who had been out of electoral politics for nearly a decade. Reagan's message was direct. Détente was appeasement. The Soviet Union wasn't a partner seeking stability. It was an adversary bent on global domination. While American leaders negotiated, Moscow built missiles. While Washington cut defense budgets, the Kremlin expanded its military machine. Reagan didn't frame this as a policy disagreement. He framed it as a matter of survival. Ford narrowly won the Republican nomination, but the primary exposed a fracture in American conservatism. Reagan's base wasn't satisfied with managed competition. They wanted confrontation. They wanted to rebuild American military superiority. And they believed that weakness, not strength, was what invited Soviet aggression. Jimmy Carter won the general election in 1976, promising honesty and a fresh approach to foreign policy. His national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, was Polish by birth and deeply skeptical of Soviet intentions. Brzezinski believed that the Soviet system was inherently expansionist and that détente had masked this reality rather than resolved it. The first test came quickly. In December 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. The invasion wasn't spontaneous. Moscow feared that Afghanistan was drifting toward the West. A pro-communist government was losing control to Islamic insurgents backed by Pakistan and covertly by the CIA. Leonid Brezhnev, the Soviet leader, ordered the invasion to prevent Afghanistan from becoming a staging ground for anti-Soviet activity on the Soviet border. For Americans, the invasion shattered any remaining illusions about détente. The Soviets had violated every principle of restraint that the agreements were supposed to enforce. Carter responded with grain embargoes, a boycott of the 1980 Moscow Olympics, and a dramatic increase in military spending. He also authorized the CIA to arm and train Afghan insurgents, a decision that would have consequences reaching far beyond Afghanistan itself. The 1980 presidential election became a final reckoning with the détente era. Ronald Reagan, running again with a clearer platform and stronger support, presented himself as the only candidate willing to confront Soviet expansion directly. Carter was portrayed as weak, naive, and out of his depth. In November 1980, Reagan won decisively. Before we pause and recalibrate for a moment, understand this. The election of Ronald Reagan marked the end of détente and the beginning of a second, more aggressive phase of the Cold War. American policymakers and the American public had concluded that compromise with the Soviet Union had failed. What came next would demand a fundamentally different strategy. If you want to grasp the mechanisms and the declassified reasoning behind why this shift happened, why American and Soviet leaders made the choices they did during détente, the detailed guide available in the description breaks down the strategic calculations with primary documents and archival analysis that most textbooks skip over. It's the kind of resource that turns surface-level history into something you can actually understand and defend in conversation. Reagan's presidency began with a clear ideological agenda. The Soviet Union wasn't just a competitor, it was, in his words, an evil empire. This wasn't diplomatic language. It was a moral judgment embedded in strategic doctrine. Where Nixon and Kissinger had treated the Cold War as a game of great power management, Reagan viewed it as a contest between fundamentally incompatible systems. His administration moved quickly. Defense spending increased dramatically. The Pentagon received authorization for new weapon systems, the MX missile, the B-1 bomber, the stealth fighter. Strategic nuclear forces were modernized. Conventional forces were expanded. Military readiness became the explicit focus of national policy. Simultaneously, Reagan authorized massive covert operations. The CIA intensified its support for the Afghan insurgency. American operatives worked with Pakistan's military to funnel weapons, training, and intelligence to the Mujahideen fighting Soviet forces. In Central America, Reagan backed anti-communist rebels in Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Guatemala. In Poland, the CIA supported underground resistance to Soviet-backed communist rule. The strategy had a name in policy circles: rollback. The goal wasn't merely to contain Soviet expansion, but to reverse it. To push back against communist movements globally, to make Soviet power increasingly costly to maintain. This was a rejection of Nixon's détente, but also a rejection of Eisenhower's doctrine of containment. It was something more ambitious, and, Reagan believed, more necessary. By 1985, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev was inheriting a state in fiscal crisis. The war in Afghanistan had drained billions. The arms race with America had consumed resources the Soviet economy could no longer sustain. Gorbachev knew the system needed radical change. He introduced glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, hoping to salvage communism through transparency and reform. But transparency had a cost he didn't anticipate. Once Soviet citizens could see the rot, once they could speak about it, the grip loosened. Once you give people permission to question, you can't easily take it back. Reagan's military buildup, the proxy wars, the economic pressure, they all mattered. They forced the Kremlin to choose between guns and bread. But Gorbachev's decision to open the system, to allow debate, to permit some freedom, that was the fracture that no amount of military spending alone could have created. The Soviet Union didn't collapse because America built more weapons. It collapsed because its own people, finally allowed to speak, decided it wasn't worth saving. This is the revelation I promised you at the beginning. Every fallen civilization, every collapsed empire, Rome, Constantinople, the Spanish Habsburgs, the French Ancien Regime, fell not because a stronger enemy simply overwhelmed them with force. They fell because their own internal contradictions, finally exposed and confronted, became impossible to manage. Power strategies fail not when an opponent is stronger, but when the system itself becomes unsustainable, and its people refuse to sustain it anymore. America and Russia both inherited the lesson of that moment, though they read it differently. America saw itself as victorious. The stronger strategy had prevailed. The military buildup worked. Containment, reinforced by rollback, had defeated the Soviet threat. That narrative shaped American foreign policy for the next 3 decades. More military presence, more defense spending, more interventions to prevent the rise of rival powers. Russia, humbled and diminished, learned something else. It learned that military power alone cannot sustain a state if internal legitimacy is gone, and it learned that it could never again afford to compete directly with American military spending. The next time Russia sought to challenge American dominance, it wouldn't be through open competition. It would be through asymmetry, proxy wars, information warfare, cyber operations, nuclear brinkmanship at lower costs. And here's what matters for you right now. That same tension between military power and internal legitimacy, between expensive dominance and sustainable resilience, still governs how nations compete. Every empire that spent itself into collapse did so because it prioritized projecting power over maintaining the conditions that make power meaningful. The money, the weapons, the forward bases, they're expensive. The citizens at home notice. They wonder if those resources should be somewhere else. They question whether the strategy is working. That's not weakness. That's democracy noticing reality. Your challenge this week is simple. When you read about military spending, about defense budgets, about interventions abroad, ask yourself one question. Is this making the nation stronger, or is it hollowing out the nation from within? The Romans asked that question too late. The Soviets learned it at the very end. America and Russia are still deciding whether they'll learn it at all. Thank you for staying with this story all the way through. If you lived through any of these decades, I'd genuinely like to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell me what you remember, what surprised you in this telling, or what you wish more people understood about this era. Subscribe to Cold War Clarity so you never miss a new breakdown of the decades that shaped the world we still live in today, and turn on notifications so you catch each video the moment it goes live. I'll see you on the next one.